Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. Welcome to the last scheduled Barbara Bush Foundation Adult Literacy X Prize webinar. We're very excited to wrap this up with Ideas 42, a behavioral design lab. I'm just going to turn it straight over to DJ, who's joining us from Ideas 42. Very excited to have this. Thank you so much. And for anybody that is watching live, please don't forget that you can submit your questions through the Q&A app in the Google Hangout on Air. I'll see those and I'll be able to turn those over to Ideas 42. So DJ, please take it away.
Great. Thanks, Ben, and hello and welcome everyone to this Behavioral Science 101 webinar. Before we get started, I just want to thank X Prize for inviting Ideas 42 to give this webinar. The Adult Literacy Prize is super exciting and definitely has the potential to have a huge impact. So naturally, we're excited to contribute in a small way by hopefully helping competitors to make their apps as impactful as possible. So by way of introductions, my name is DJ Neary. I'm an associate here at Ideas 42. I'm also joined by Josh Wright, who's one of our executive directors. He may chime in from time to time as well. Just to get us started today, I'm going to introduce Ideas 42 and the work we do here briefly, and then touch on what I hope to accomplish in the webinar, and then we can jump right into the meat of it. So what is Ideas 42? Well, first and foremost, we're a nonprofit with the goal of using behavioral science to do social good. So what do we mean by behavioral science? Behavioral science is basically the intersection of fields that study how people actually make decisions, so fields like behavioral economics and social and cognitive psychology. And at Ideas 42, we work on what we call behavioral problems. So very broadly, this means we look at a behavior with the thought, people are doing X and we want them to do Y. And we use our understanding of human behavior to uncover why people are doing X, and then we help create designs that help them to do Y instead. So the result is that we're basically trying to help people do more of what they want to do and less of what they don't want to do. So we date back to 2008 when we were founded by some leading academics at top US universities, and since then we've maintained those academic roots. So we're fortunate to have over 70 of the top behavioral scientists as our founders and affiliates to advise and partner on our projects. But we also take a more practical approach, so we combine these leading academics with experienced practitioners who have a record of getting things done in the real world. So we currently have a team of over 60 staff members who are trained in behavioral economics, psychology, public policy, and related fields who are dedicated to applying behavioral insights to improve lives. So we work across a variety of domains, which you can see here. We're also supporting the establishment of the Social and Behavioral Sciences team at the White House, and we've partnered with the Robin Hood Foundation on their $5 million College Success Prize, which could be awarded to an app that shows a demonstrated significant impact in on-time community college graduation. So that's a little bit about what we do here at Ideas 42. I just want to touch briefly on what I want to cover in the webinar today. So first, I want to give you a brief introduction to behavioral science. That should take about 10 minutes. Then I want to talk about how to define a behavioral problem, which is a crucial first step to be able to correctly apply behavioral insights. Then for the majority of the time, I want to go over 6 important psychologies, behavioral insights essentially, that could help you improve your app. And I want to talk about how you could possibly apply them to your specific apps. And then lastly, if we have time, I'll give you a few examples of how these behavioral insights have been applied in the real world and shown real impact. So let's just jump right into it. So for an introduction to behavioral science, I think the best way to do it, if you'll bear with me here, is to actually give you a quick 3-question quiz. So I promise it'll only take a few minutes. So here's the first question. If you have a pen and paper and you want to write down your answers, we can go over them in a few minutes. So the first question is, a cup and a saucer cost $1.10 in total. The cup costs $1 more than the saucer. How much does the saucer cost? So I'll give you a few more seconds to think about that, but generally just write down the first answer that comes to your mind. All right, for the second question, if it takes 5 machines 5 minutes to make 5 widgets, how long will it take 100 machines to make 100 widgets? And for the final question, in a pond, there's a patch of lily pads, and every day the patch doubles in size. And if it takes 48 days for the patch to cover the entire pond, how long would it take for the patch to cover half the pond? All right, so you've had a few minutes to think about those, so let's go over the answers. So for the first question, a cup and a saucer cost $1.10 in total. The cup costs $1 more than the saucer. How much does the saucer cost? And for each of these questions, there's an interesting answer, which a lot of people choose, and then there's a right answer. So the interesting answer here is 10 cents. It seems intuitively appealing. It just pops into your mind immediately. But if the saucer costs 10 cents, then the cup costs $1 more, so $1.10, and the total is $1.20. So obviously, when you think about it, the right answer is 5 cents for the saucer and $1.05 for the cup, and they add up to $1.10 in total. Similarly, with the second question, the answer that pops into everyone's head immediately is 100 minutes. 5 machines, 5 minutes, 5 widgets, 100 machines, 100 widgets, 100 minutes. But again, if you think about this a little more closely, the answer is actually 5 minutes, because you're increasing the amount of machines as well. And finally, with the last question, you see 48 days and you see that the patch doubles in size, and the intuitive answer seems to just be to split 48 days in half and assume that it would take 24 days for the patch to cover half the pond, because 24 is half of 48. But again, when you think about it more closely, it becomes obvious that the correct answer is 47 days. On the 47th day, the patch of lily pads covers half the pond, and then it doubles, so on the 48th day, it covers the entire pond. Now, these questions are interesting, and the point of these questions is to basically illustrate that we don't always think rationally. These questions are actually pretty simple, and we should all get them right. None of these were taken from a Google interview or any book of brain teasers. But I'm guessing at the same time that some of you, or most of you, got one or more wrong, and the majority of people do. So why does it matter that we aren't always thinking rational, or we aren't always rational calculators? We don't always get these questions right. Well, it matters because most of the policies and programs assume that we are, and this assumption actually has serious consequences for how effective these programs are in helping people that they're designed to help. So basically, the main takeaway of these questions is that people are complicated. This is one of our favorite images to introduce people to behavioral science. It's a very entertaining photo. It shows how people are quite complicated and quite inconsistent. You have a group of people here. They want to be healthy. They're going to the gym. But they've chosen to take the escalator over burning a few extra calories taking the stairs. And while this fact might not be surprising in and of itself, it is incredibly powerful. Because once we appreciate that people are inconsistent, it means we have to be more mindful in designing our programs and policies. It means that we can't always assume that people will necessarily do what's rational or optimal or in their best interest just because a program or policy tells them what that is. And we also can't look at people's behavior and necessarily infer their preferences. So suppose someone fails to save enough money for the future. That doesn't necessarily mean that they don't want to save. They very might well want to save, but it could be difficult for them to consistently pursue this goal for a variety of reasons. And the same is true for adult literacy. So people may want to read and write better. They may have the resources or know-how to actually pursue this goal, but there may be other things stopping them from following through on this intention. It could be other stressors in their life, the context that they're living in. They don't see a lot of other people around them doing that behavior, so they don't think that it's normal. There are a lot of other factors that influence our behavior besides just weighing the rational costs and benefits. So there really are a lot of ways that we behave inconsistently. But there's good news too, and the good news is that scientists have studied these inconsistencies and identified patterns and drivers of them. So this means that we can learn to recognize these patterns and the conditions under which people behave inconsistently, and then we can design solutions that help people do more of what they want to do and less of what they don't want to do. So I think it's worth breaking this down a little bit more. This is a standard traditional model of decision making. It assumes that actions and outcomes follow from our decisions in a very linear way. So I have some information, I weigh the pros and cons and consider what I want, I decide yes or no, I act accordingly, and boom, I get the outcome that I wanted. And this is how most policies and programs are designed. So we provide people knowledge, we provide them economic incentives, and we expect that people will act accordingly. But in reality, this is how we actually make decisions. The other model is definitely incomplete. So there are a number of other factors about the environment in which the decision is made and the action is taken that really matter. Every time we are making a decision, our brains are processing a huge amount of information, and we can't pay attention to all of it. So we use mental shortcuts. We focus on some information and block out other information. We use contextual clues to figure out how we should act. So just to give you a few examples, here are a few things that influence the decisions we actually make. So the number of choices and how they're presented in relation to each other can be a huge driver of what decision we make. Even seemingly minuscule hassles in a process that we must do to achieve the outcome can determine whether we achieve that outcome or not. So for example, just needing a stamp on an envelope to mail a form in on time can be enough to derail people in a process. It can be a hassle to find a stamp and get one, and even though the benefits in the long term of mailing that letter in on time are much larger than the cost of the stamp, that little cost now can affect our entire choice to make that decision. And also a heavy influence on our behavior is what other people are doing. So we're constantly looking around to infer what's the acceptable behavior in a certain situation, and whatever we infer that behavior to be, it can have a huge effect on what we decide to do. So all these types of considerations are usually done subconsciously, and they not only affect how we make our initial decisions, but whether we even consider an option at all. So they affect whether we follow through with the actions we intend to take, and that process in and of itself can actually change the outcomes as well. So in behavioral science, observing and understanding these contextual cues and shortcuts is very important. When we understand how these contextual features affect our decisions, we can create designs that mitigate them or change them or avoid them or even use them for good. So when we realize that we don't actually make decisions in a straightforward, rational way, that we aren't these impersonal, rational calculators, we can start to identify specific situations and specific outcomes where we're prone to, quote, misbehave, so to speak, and then we can design solutions. So the first step in applying the behavioral approach is defining the problem. So we specialize in applied behavioral science, and applying behavioral science requires this rigorous approach. And like I said, the first step is correctly defining the problem. So I know that defining the problem may sound a little bit boring. It may sound like something we could skip over, but it's really not. And we have this quote here from Albert Einstein to back us up on that. So the problem definition stage is really where we lay the groundwork for the behavioral approach. It frames how we solve the issue. And if we don't define the problem correctly, it's going to be hard to identify the right concepts and identify where we can make the biggest impact through the application of behavioral science. So, for instance, at ideas42, we often have partners come to us with a problem they want our help to fix. But when we look more closely at the context of that problem, it's really something that's quite different. one of the most common things we see is people will come to us and assume that people don't understand the benefits of taking some behavior they want them to take. Say they want people to save more for retirement, and they assume that people just don't understand the benefits of saving for retirement. But is that really the right problem? In reality, it's often something else. Maybe they do understand the benefits, but they're failing to follow through on their intention to save for other reasons. So defining the problem correctly, figuring out what is the behavior we actually want to change, is hugely important to applying behavioral science correctly. So we have these 3 guidelines for defining a behavioral problem, and when we're talking about some of the psychologies you can apply later, I hope you can remember these principles and start to think about whether some of how you would define a problem that might exist in your app. So these 3 principles are: first, focusing on a specific behavior rather than a general issue. Second, you want to make sure you state the problem without any assumptions about possible solutions. So oftentimes the lack of a particular solution is not a good problem statement. And lastly, we want to make sure that the problem is defined at the right level. So this is a helpful framework for thinking about behavioral problems that might exist within your app. So people are doing X and we want them to do Y. And most times the problem is actually people are doing X and we, as well as they, want to do Y instead. For instance, I'm sure that most of us would like to eat healthier, exercise more, save more for retirement. We might want to read more every day or spend more time with our friends and family, but we don't end up doing a lot of the things that we intend to do. And applying this framework to your problems can be a little bit tricky. So there are many types of problems that might not immediately seem to fit this framework, but you just have to remember that behavioral science is relevant in any situation where you're dealing with people making decisions and taking actions. So to make this a little more concrete, I just want to briefly walk through 2 examples of how to define a behavioral problem and whether that behavioral problem meets the 3 criteria that we talked about. So first, let's talk about how to define a behavioral problem in relation to healthy eating. So here is an original problem statement that we had received. People choose unhealthy meals because they don't have access to quality nutrition information. So this problem statement does focus on a specific issue, but it does not state the problem without embedded assumptions. Clearly it says it is just assuming that the lack of access to quality nutrition information is what's driving people to choose unhealthy meals. And that's not going to help us get to the bottom of what the behavior is that we actually want to change. We can't just assume that we know the answer and the definition of the problem. And lastly, the problem is defined at the right level because it's defined at the individual level and people are the ones who are choosing their meals. So if we want to make this a better problem statement, we can use the framework that I talked about a slide ago. And so we can change it into people are eating unhealthy meals at home and we would like them to eat healthy meals at home. So this is in the people are doing X and we'd like them to do Y framework. And when we put it in this framework, it's going to be a lot easier to apply the insights we talk about later. So let's look at one more example. This one's around college saving. So the original problem statement here is that students don't have enough money to get through college. Now the problem with this problem statement is that it's not focused on a specific behavior. It's not actually saying something that we want to change about students' behavior. It's just stating a problem without any embedded assumptions, but it's not focusing on a specific behavior. It's also not defined at the right level. So it might not actually be students who aren't saving enough money to get through college. It may actually be parents. So we can redefine this problem statement to, again, be in the framework of people are doing X and we want them to do Y by saying parents aren't saving enough for a child's college education and we want them to make regular monthly deposits into a savings account. So when we put problems in this framework, we're going to be able to apply our behavioral science concepts much easier. So I just want to pause for a second, and Ben, I don't know if anyone has any questions so far on that section, and if not, we can just jump into how to apply behavioral science.
No questions so far, DJ, but I just want to remind all our reviewers that you can submit your questions through the Q&A app. It should be on the left side of your screen, so please do that, and we'll try to get those questions in towards the end. Thanks, DJ.
Yep. Thanks, Ben. So we got through the mechanics of defining a behavioral problem, and now we can get to what I think is the fun part, and that's applying behavioral science to solve problems. So before we get into the 6 psychologies that I want to talk about today, I just want to touch on a theme that will run through all these insights and basically all of behavioral science. And that theme is that context matters. So this is one of the most important principles in social psychology. Oftentimes, when we observe other people's behavior, we assume that their actions say something about who they intrinsically are rather than the situation that they're in. And there's actually a vast body of research in social psychology and other fields that supports the conclusion that contextual and situational factors are much more reliable causes and predictors of our behavior than any inherent personality traits or disposition. And that's what this book by Lee Ross and Richard E. Nisbet, The Person in the Situation, it's one of the key points that they drive home, and that's a point that we take with us in all our work here at ideas42. And in a way, this is kind of great news because it makes our job a lot easier. If we can design contexts in which people make good decisions or make minor tweaks to a context that's experienced by a lot of people, we can more easily scale our designs and have a positive impact on people's lives. Much easier than if we had to design individual interventions that fit everyone's idiosyncrasies. So with that in mind, I want to briefly go over the 6 insights that we think can help you improve your app today. So I chose these because 1, I think you can get the main idea of what these insights mean in a short webinar, and 2, I think they have particular relevance to some issues you might be having with your app. So I'll go through each one of them, kind of talk about a study that supports the conclusions, it supports what the insight is, and then I'll talk about some takeaways that hopefully you can use immediately with your app. So the first one I want to talk about today is procrastination and prospective memory failure. So procrastination is pretty simple. We all know it. We often put off tomorrow what we could do today. We have a picture here demonstrating that. That might be a little bit outdated. I won't ask how many emails are sitting in your inboxes or how many days or months they might have been sitting there. But since we're all familiar with procrastination, we all know that it can really take a toll on important life outcomes. It might seem simple enough to say that I'll do it today or tomorrow or I'll do it next week, but oftentimes these tomorrows add up quickly, and before you know it, it might be too late to take any action at all. And in some extreme cases, like getting a medical test on time, procrastination can have some really terrible effects on our life. So even for behavioral science, procrastination is a problem. Many of us in our office are fall victim to procrastination all the time. I know that I do personally. A few months ago, for instance, I had to go to Ethiopia for a project, but procrastinated on sending my visa application into the embassy on time. I ended up having to take a train from New York to DC and basically begging the Ethiopian embassy to process it on time. So the key here is that no one is immune from procrastination, even when it's your job to think about how procrastination can affect people's lives every day. Just thinking about it and being aware of it often isn't enough to prevent it from affecting your life. And now, prospective memory failure is a little bit different. So, prospective memory failure is forgetting to remember or remembering at the wrong time. So, for instance, while I'm giving this webinar, it might occur to me that I need to send an important email later today. But obviously, I can't do that right now, and so who knows if I'll be able to remember later. So it doesn't really matter that I remembered. It's more an issue of whether I remember at the right time when I can take action to follow through on my intention. So there are certain times that we know from our experience and through the literature when people tend to procrastinate and people tend to forget. And with each of these situations, there's a few solutions that we can apply to help people avoid these behaviors. So people tend to procrastinate when the process is open-ended with no fixed deadlines. And one of the ways you can address this is simply by imposing external deadlines through the app or through the process that you're interacting with your constituent population. People also tend to procrastinate when they can't finish a task entirely in one sitting. So if something is going to take people 40 minutes to do on an app and they only regularly have 20-minute increments, they're not going to just want to do half at a time. Oftentimes that motivates people to put things off. So breaking down tasks in bite-sized chunks will help prevent people from procrastinating on actually doing them. And lastly, people tend to procrastinate when there are future benefits to an action, but they bear the costs presently. So one way to get around this is try to move forward some of the benefits that come later to give people a little carrot now to get them started in the process to kind of help overcome this present bias that we have where we're overweighting our present satisfaction and underweighting our future satisfaction. So for prospective memory failure, for times when you tend to forget, a main one that I think is probably true with the population that you're dealing with the app is that people have limited cognitive bandwidth. And what that means is that they basically have a lot of other things going on in their lives. They might be working multiple jobs, they might be very busy, they might have young children, and they simply forget because they're so worried about remembering other things that are important in their lives as well. Secondly, we tend to forget, quite obviously, when we aren't reminded. So reminders are very important within the structure of an app to make sure people are coming back, but also you have to remind people at the right time. So like I talked about before, reminders are valuable, but the timing of the reminders is incredibly important. And timing is something that we're going to talk about with several of the insights today. It's very important not only to use behavioral insights correctly, but make sure we're reaching the constituent population at a time when we can make that information really salient so they can act on it. So that's the first psychology I wanted to talk about today. And the second one is framing and salience. So the insight here is that the way a choice is presented, or what information we make salient when people are choosing or acting, and how that choice is framed, can have remarkable effect on the actions that we choose to take. So let's take the example of this picture. Typically, you'd throw your trash in a bin labeled trash or garbage. It's a split-second automatic decision, and you're really not thinking about it at all. You're not thinking about where that Snapple bottle that you throw out is going to end up. But the fact is, if you put that Snapple bottle in the trash, we all know it's going to end up in a disgusting landfill somewhere. And the thing is, pretty much everyone knows this, but they aren't thinking about it at the time that they throw it away. So to make this information more salient at the right time, what if we, like in the picture, relabeled trash as landfill instead? So this exact thing has been done, and the results are actually pretty remarkable. So simply by using a landfill label instead of a trash or garbage label, that's increased recycling by 29%, and it's decreased the amount of trash thrown away by 18%. So why does this work? It's because we're actually altering the framing of the choice. It's now landfill or recycle instead of trash or recycle, and landfill sounds like a much more extreme option that we want to avoid. And crucially, we're also making this information salient at the right time. So like I said before, I can't emphasize how crucial timing is in a behavioral intervention. Notice that to achieve this outcome, we didn't have to start an educational campaign about the evils of landfills or the benefits of recycling. We simply presented the consequences of people's actions right when they were deciding what to do and doing it. So the main takeaway here is this. Altering what information is most salient in the exact moment of choice can actually have surprisingly large influences on our behavior. For instance, if you want to get users to set a reminder in the app to use it again soon, you may want to consider pairing that message with an appeal about the benefits of using the app or something that would motivate them to take action right now. So the third psychology I want to go over today is anchoring. And anchoring is our tendency to rely heavily on a piece of information that we receive early in a process. And oftentimes this happens on a subconscious level, and the information that we receive can be totally arbitrary. And so anchoring can lead to some very surprising outcomes, and I can illustrate that with a study. So for example, Campbell's tomato soup went on sale for 10% off, and customers in this study were told one of two messages. In condition 1, they were told they could buy as many cans as they wanted at 10% off. So if these people were doomsday preppers, or if they're living in an underground bunker stocking up on canned goods for the end of the world, they could have literally bought the entire store, no limits whatsoever. And in the second condition, customers were limited to 12 cans per customer. So the surprising outcome here is that in the no limit condition, customers bought 3.5 cans per customer, but in the limit 12 per customer, they bought double that, 7 cans per customer. So why did they do that? Well, first, they see the limit 12 per customer sign in the store, and they ask themselves, how many should I buy? And they're already subconsciously anchored to that implicit suggestion to buy 12 per customer. They're actually influenced by just seeing that sign, and they're anchoring to that amount, and therefore buying more on average than those who had no anchor. So the point of this, the real takeaway here, is that it's important to be aware of what your users might be subconsciously anchoring to within your app. But you should also realize that it's actually possible to design around anchoring as well. So let's say your users are completing 3 to 4 modules or activities or games on your app per week, and you want them to do more. So you can always remind them that they can do as many as they want per week, or you can remind them how valuable these activities are, but that's likely to not be that effective. You could try to take the same insight from this study and say you could do up to 10 or up to 20 modules per week, and it's quite possible that users might anchor to that number and increase the amount of modules that they're actually completing. So the fourth insight I want to talk about today is social norms. And social norms are a bit tricky, so I want to take a little longer on this, and please feel free to type in your questions to Ben if anything is unclear. So put simply, there are 2 types of social norms. There are descriptive norms, and that's what people are actually doing in a given context. So for instance, if you go to a concert, you often see people on their cell phones taking videos and pictures, and these days that's pretty much the norm at those events. So that's the descriptive norm for going to a concert. That's what you see people doing. Then there are also injunctive or prescriptive norms. So a prescriptive norm is generally what we want people to do. It's the acceptable behavior in a given context. So for instance, the prescriptive norm at a concert might be the opposite. It might be that you should put your phone away and not be taking video or photos. And the main point here is that in general, social norms have a really large impact on how we behave, especially when we're in an uncertain situation or we're simply unsure what's acceptable within a given context. We look around us for clues as to what others are doing. And we look around and gather this information to determine what the descriptive norm is, what other people are doing. So social norms can have some interesting effects. So I want to give you an example that references this picture on the slide here. So in one study, researchers changed the environment of a parking garage like this one to be either littered or clean. And then they placed flyers on all the cars in the lot, and they observed how many people took those flyers off their cars and disposed of them. So when litter was already present, 32% of the subjects took the flyers off their car and littered them on the ground. So that's the situation where there's a dirty parking garage, you get out of your car, or you go back to your car, there's a flyer on it, and people just throw it on the ground because everyone else has thrown it on the ground. But when no litter was present in the garage, people took that flyer off their car, and only 14% of them disposed of it on the ground by littering it. But even more interestingly, they had a Confederate, so one of the research assistants, clearly litter in front of the subjects. So in the cases where the Confederate littered into an already littered environment, so when he littered into a parking garage that was already covered in litter, people who saw this littered more than people who didn't see it. So that makes sense, right? It licensed them to litter. The parking lot's dirty, you see someone throw trash in it, right in front of you, and you're like, okay, I guess this is the acceptable thing to do here. They observed the descriptive norm in this situation and they followed it. But there's an interesting part here as well. So when people saw this research assistant litter into a parking garage that was clean, they littered less than when they didn't see the research assistant litter. So this is because one person's deviant behavior in this case, littering into a clean environment, actually just made it clear to them that the descriptive norm was to not litter. It highlighted the fact that this was the only piece of litter and it's otherwise clean. So the point here is that we are constantly paying attention to our surroundings and interpreting information in a way that helps us infer what the descriptive norm is. So people, once we infer the descriptive norm, we generally try to follow along with that. So the takeaway here is that people are really heavily influenced by what they think other people around them are doing. So if other people around them are behaving desirably, behaving how we all want them to behave, it's good to highlight that. So for instance, if you have a high usage rate on your app, or most people are using it for an hour or two a day, it might be good to message that to everyone using the app. That establishes, it conveys the descriptive norm, and then people are likely to follow along with that. But if people are behaving undesirably, you don't want to make that salient. So if people are underperforming, it's not good. If people are underusing the app, it's not good to let people know that that's the case, because instead of trying to compensate for that, people will think it's normal to use it for only a few minutes a day or once a week. And also with norms, they're much more effective when the comparison group that you're using for people is more local. So for instance, if I wanted to convince X Prize contestants to meet their deadlines on time, I would want to use some message saying, for instance, like 90% of X Prize teams meet their deadlines on time, which would be more effective than saying 90% of prize competitor teams meet that deadline on time. Because when I talk about X Prize, it's a more specific reference group and it's more relatable for the people who I'm trying to affect. So that was a lot of information, so I want to actually give you guys a chance to look at this picture here as a little pop quiz and decide if this seems to be an effective use of social norms. So do you think this poster is a good way to encourage high school students to stay in school? And I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. All right, so the correct answer here is no, it is not. So this sign is actually the opposite of what we want to do and what I just warned against doing. So if you read this sign, it says 7,000 high school students drop out of school every day. That's a stack of desks 12 Empire State Buildings high. So what does that do? It draws your attention to a behavior that is undesirable, that is counter to the prescriptive norm, what we want people to do, and it makes it seem really common. I mean, 12 Empire State Buildings of desks, that's a huge amount of desks. That seems like a huge amount of students. It makes it seem like many students are dropping out of school every day. And if a student came up and saw this sign, a student who might be thinking about dropping out of school, they might say, well, okay, everyone's dropping out. Maybe it's okay if I do too. It seems like this is actually much more common than I thought, so it must be okay for me to do. So this ad campaign, they recognize that people are influenced by what others are doing, but they got it wrong, and they assumed that if if people see that lots of students are dropping out of school, they'll spring into action to prevent the problem. But what actually happens is it just makes it seem like it's the normal thing to do, and it's likely to influence more students to drop out. So let's move on to the fifth psychology, and that is stereotype threat. And these next two psychologies are ones that I think might be particularly relevant to the populations that you're dealing with who you're trying to help with your apps. So the main takeaway of stereotype threat is this. So basically, stereotype threat is when a person, often a woman or a member of a minority group, feels at risk of confirming some negative stereotype about a group they belong to. And the anxiety that this causes often causes them to perform more poorly on a test or an assessment. So oftentimes stereotype threat is something that we can cause without even meaning to. So we kind of have to be vigilant and make sure that we're not priming people to perform worse than they're actually capable of performing. So for example, on one study with African American and white college students, they had them take a difficult test using items from the GRE verbal exam. So in the stereotype threat condition, students were told that their performance on their test would be a good indicator of their underlying intellectual abilities. And in the non-threat condition, they were told that the test was simply a problem-solving exercise and was not diagnostic of their actual ability. So the researchers looked at the performance of these two groups. They controlled for other covariates that might be affecting the outcome, and the result was this. African Americans performed worse than their white counterparts in the stereotype threat condition, but they performed the same as their white counterparts in the non-threat condition. So what's going on here? In the stereotype threat condition, an African American student might be thinking that since this test is a measure of intelligence, this might bring up some stereotypes about African Americans performing worse on standardized tests, or an African American student feeling like they have to represent their entire group with their performance on this test, and this might make them more anxious and less likely to perform up to their true ability. But in this, when the same test was given and just framed differently and told that it was just a problem-solving exercise, they performed just as well. So these studies have been done in a variety of other situations as well. For instance, they've been done with Asian American females. When they gave Asian American females a math test and primed their identity as a female before the test, they performed more poorly than when they primed their identity of being an Asian American before the test. So the stereotype there is that women may feel that they do worse at math than men. There's that stereotype out there that exists, and priming their identity as a woman makes that stereotype salient in their mind, and it's kind of causing an anxiety that causes them to not perform up to their true potential. But the opposite is true with the stereotype of Asian Americans maybe being better at math, and that stereotype might have given them more confidence to perform better. So basically, we want to be mindful of whether we're priming stereotype threat or not in the users of the apps. So there's a few principles to follow and a few ways you can try to mitigate any effects that stereotype threat might be having on your users. So one is basically you want to remind users that difficulties in learning are part of a normal learning curve or an adjustment process, not something that's unique to them or unique to their racial group or the other group identity that they hold. Second, you want to remind users to reflect on values in their life beyond school or literacy or learning that are sources of self-worth for them. So when people get too invested in defining their self-worth in relation to their academic achievements, that's going to cause some anxiety and worsen their performance. But studies have shown that if you have people talk about their values outside of the academic sphere, then that can help mitigate against the effects that stereotype threat might be having on their performance. And there's one more way to mitigate for stereotype threat, and it's actually the sixth psychology that I want to talk about today, and that is growth mindset. So growth mindset is basically the belief that intelligence is malleable and can be increased through hard work. And the opposite of growth mindset is fixed mindset, which is the belief that intelligence is solely genetic, predetermined, and that there's nothing you can do to change it. And unfortunately, fixed mindset is actually quite common, and it can have some really bad consequences, especially for people who might feel a bit marginalized, overwhelmed, or behind. But there's good news too, and the good news is that growth mindset can be taught and has been taught successfully in a variety of settings. So just to give you one example, a growth mindset study from 2011 randomly assigned 7th graders in New York City to either a treatment or control condition. So in the control, these 7th grade students were taught basic study skills and some basics about how the brain works. In the treatment condition, the students were taught the same material, but they had one twist. And the twist was that they were told that if they work hard, they can actually grow their brains and become smarter. Now, to give you a little context, the jump from 6th to 7th grade in New York City is especially trying for students. Middle school is a whole new game. Oftentimes, students struggle to make that transition well, and they can kind of fall behind and not be able to catch back up. So it's interesting to see if teaching these students growth mindset, which does nothing to make the curriculum easier or change how it's taught, can really have an effect. And the results show that it really can. So in the control condition, grades dropped from a C plus to a C minus, which is the average change for 6th to 7th grade in New York City. But in the treatment condition, those who were taught the principles of growth mindset, they didn't experience any drop in their grades. When they were faced with new, harder challenges than what they were used to, they were able to compensate by working harder and believing in the value of that hard work. So I think the takeaway here is something that's particularly relevant for the population that we're dealing with. So many adults who are currently reading at a 3rd grade level or below, they may believe that they're dumb or they simply lack the ability to learn to read well. They probably have what we'd call a fixed mindset. But the research shows that these people who have this fixed mindset can be taught to think of their brains as a muscle and that can be strengthened through hard work. So a few tips that go along with that. So consistent with this approach, it's important to offer praise for people through the app for trying hard rather than for being smart. So rewarding people's good effort primes them to develop a growth mindset where they continue to work hard, or rewarding intelligence helps to play into a fixed mindset. So there are some great examples. There's a lot of literature that's very digestible out there of how to teach growth mindset, and it's actually easier than you'd think. So if you're interested in building in some activities or ways to encourage your users to develop a growth mindset, I'd encourage checking that out. And Carol Dweck is one of the main people to check out there if you're interested. So that was those were the 6 psychologies that I wanted to cover today, and I've kind of summarized them here on this tab today. I encourage you, if you're interested in any of them, to dig a little bit deeper so you can make sure that you're applying them correctly. These are just a quick overview and some quick tips to remind you of the key insights, but there's a lot of information out there online, academic papers, the ideas42 website under the Learn section, where you can learn more about these psychologies and how you can apply them correctly to your designs. So it looks like we have about 10 minutes left, so we have time to go over a few examples of behavioral science in the wild, and I'll take about 5 minutes on this, and then I'll hold 5 minutes if you have any questions. So if you have any questions about any of those psychologies, start typing them in now, and I'll get to them in a few minutes. So the first example of applying behavioral science in the real world that I want to talk about is around energy conservation. So this is an example of how you can leverage social norms to encourage people to use less electricity. So O-Power has created what they call their home energy reports, and these are regular reports that are mailed to utility providers' customers, and what they do is they compare each household's energy use to that of comparable households in the area. So you can see here the middle bar is what your household would be consuming. Then you have a comparison to your most efficient neighbors, and then to all of your neighbors, and they control for things like the size of your house or even the number of people. So the main insight here is that you can, by comparing your energy usage to your neighbors, you can kind of infer the descriptive norm. You can infer how much, you can see how much energy other people are using, and you can adjust your behavior accordingly. You also get a little smiley face for your performance, a little feedback on how you're doing, and you also often get tips that show you how you can conserve more energy. So for instance, you might see here that you're doing good, but you also have the possibility of doing great, and to do great, maybe you can get tips like unplug your appliances when they're not in use, or make sure you turn off lights when you exit a room. And just providing this information in a totally benign way to households actually has resulted in a 2.7% reduction in energy consumption. And 2.7% might not sound like a lot on the surface, but that would be the equivalent. To reduce that amount of energy, you'd have to raise energy prices by 20%. So I'd much rather have a report like this than have my energy prices raised by 20%. And if this intervention were scaled across the entire United States, it would save the equivalent of 2.2 billion. So this shows you the effect that when you're dealing with scaling up a behavioral intervention, a small change like a 2.7% reduction can actually have large effects. So the same is true with your apps, which hopefully at least the finalists will reach a large population. Even minor changes, minor behavioral tweaks in your apps can actually have very large effects at scale. So the last behavioral insight from the real world that I want to go over is this intervention around road safety that's basically using very salient feedback for drivers. So this is a picture of Lakeshore Drive in Chicago. And as you can see on the right side of the picture, there's a bit of a curve that was taking drivers by surprise. Drivers weren't slowing down enough to go around this curve, and it was causing accidents and fatalities. So someone had the brilliant idea of painting these horizontal lines across the road. And if you look more closely, you can see that from the left side of the screen to the right, the distance between the horizontal lines gets closer together. And what that does is when drivers are driving along the road, it gives them the feeling that they're driving faster than they are as they approach the road. Because oftentimes, how we're actually determining how fast we're driving is just observing the context around us. How fast are we passing those trees? How blurred are the white dashed lines in the road that we're driving on? So this intervention actually caused people to slow down more and less accidents on this turn, because people would naturally brake because they'd feel they were going faster than they were as they approached the turn, because they were just responding to the context that they were in. They were picking up the clue that they were traveling fast because the lines appeared to be getting closer together. So this is great because it works through the subconscious way that we're actually interpreting our environment, and it gives you feedback through that unconscious mechanism rather than posting large signs telling people to slow down or increasing the number of cops patrolling the area. You're just playing into the way people are already processing that information. So that's the final example. I want to quickly say thanks to all of you who joined and listened. I hope you found that information useful, or at least it piqued your interest in behavioral science, so you can do a little more exploration around how you can apply behavioral science concepts to your app. And since it looks like we have about 5 minutes left, I'm not sure if any of you had any questions, but I'm happy to stick around here. And Ben, if anyone submitted them, please feel free to let me know.
DJ, thank you so much. We don't have any questions at this time, but you put a lot of good information there, and I really hope a lot of the teams will kind of think some of these through and figure out how to put them in, use some of those principles in their apps. So that's definitely much appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, so I think we'll just kind of wrap it up. I know that if anybody does have some kind of last-minute questions, or if they view this later on and they have some questions, if you wouldn't mind, maybe I could pass those to you. We can kind of continue the conversation.
Of course, yep.
All right, well, thank you so much, DJ, and to all of Ideas42. We really appreciate you guys joining the Adult Literacy X Prize for this presentation, and we'll just stay in touch. Good luck, everybody.